There is a day in most people's lives when they hand over a set of keys, load the last of their things into a car, and drive away from a place they lived in long enough to matter. They notify the post office. They notify the bank. They call the people who need to know. They go through the entire checklist of things that a person is supposed to do when they leave a place behind. But no one notifies the birds. And on that morning, the morning of the move or the morning after, or the morning 3 days later, when the last of the chaos has settled, the birds come back to that yard the same way they have always come, in the same order, at the same times, to the same branches, the same feeder positions, the same corners of the fence where they have always landed first before moving closer to the food. They do not know that the person who created that routine is gone. They do not have a concept for what a moving truck means, or what a forwarding address is, or what it looks like when a human being decides that a place is no longer home. What they have instead is a system. A precise, deeply encoded map of how that yard works when resources appear and who is responsible for making them appear. And on the morning you left, that system received its first anomaly signal, not when the feeder ran empty, not when the yard went quiet, but in the subtle wrongness of a door that did not open at the usual hour, a silhouette that did not cross the window at the usual time, a sound that was absent from a morning that was otherwise identical to every morning before it. What happened next in that yard is something you will never see, not because it is hidden, but because by the time it began, you were already gone. And the sequence that followed from that first morning to the weeks after is not random, and it is not simple, and it has been studied carefully enough that we can now describe it in detail. This is what your birds did when you moved. And once you understand it, the yard you are building in your new place will never feel quite the same. The morning you left, how a yard recalibrates around an absence. On the morning you moved, while you were somewhere between your old address and your new one, while you were on the highway with a car full of things that no longer had a place to belong, the birds in your old yard were going through the motions of a routine that you had built for them without knowing you were building it. The sequence probably looked from above almost normal. The early arrivals came first, the way they always do, because the dominance hierarchy that governs feeder access does not pause for human transitions. The birds that had established priority in the months or years you lived there held that priority on the morning you left, and they arrived at the times their internal clocks told them to arrive, which were the times you had inadvertently trained them around. After them came the secondary arrivals, then the ground feeders, then the birds that prefer the edges of the yard to the center of it. The choreography that had developed over the entire span of your residency played out in full on schedule with no one there to watch it. But something was different, and the data from supplementary feeding research makes clear what it was. Studies conducted through the Cornell Lab of Ornithology on habituated backyard bird populations have documented a consistent pattern that emerges in the early hours after a reliable feeding routine is disrupted. The birds do not simply arrive, find the situation unchanged or changed, and adapt immediately. Instead, visit frequency increases. In the first hours after the absence of the expected human presence, birds return to the feeder more often than they would on a normal day. Not because food is scarce, but because the pattern that food was embedded in has produced an anomaly, and their neural systems are running a higher frequency verification loop in response. This is not confusion in the way a person experiences confusion. It is a calibrated biological response to a data point that does not match the established model. The birds in your yard had built their daily routine around a pattern that included you. Not you as a person they recognized philosophically, but you as a set of reliable recurring environmental signals that predicted the availability of a high-value resource. The kitchen light that came on at the same hour, the back door that opened within a consistent window of time, the specific sequence of sounds and movements that preceded the feeder being refreshed. All of it had been absorbed into their model of how that yard operated, because that model had been accurate for long enough to be trustworthy. And on the morning you left, the model was suddenly producing results that did not match its predictions. The neurological basis for this response is worth understanding because it reframes what it means to have been a regular presence in a bird's environment. Research into the hippocampal structure of corvids, chickadees, and other species, known for advanced spatial memory, has established that these birds maintain extraordinarily detailed internal maps of their territories, maps that encode not just location, but timing reliability, and the identity of the agents responsible for specific resources. The hippocampus in a black-capped chickadee is proportionally larger than that of most other bird species relative to body size, and the cognitive work it performs extends well beyond remembering where food was cached. It tracks the predictability of the entire environment the bird operates within. When a node in that environment that has been consistently reliable suddenly goes dark, the hippocampal response is not to erase the node, but to flag it as unconfirmed and increase verification attempts. Because from an evolutionary standpoint, abandoning a high-value resource after a single failure is a worse outcome than spending additional energy to confirm whether the failure is permanent. What this means in practical terms is that on the day you moved, the birds in your yard were not simply eating breakfast. They were running a more intensive version of their normal monitoring routine, cross-referencing the signals available to them against the model they had built over months or years of your residency, looking for the confirmation signal that the model said should be arriving. The kitchen light, the door, the shadow at the window, the sound of the feeder lid, none of those signals came. You were on the highway. You were thinking about the deposit on the new place, or the furniture that needed to be reassembled, or the call you forgot to make before you left. The yard you had lived in for however long you lived there was already behind you in the way that places become behind you when you move on from them. But in that yard, the birds were in this middle of something, a biological process that had been triggered by your absence and was now running its course with the same precision that every other aspect of their behavior runs, and the process was only beginning. By the end of that first day, the pattern had already started to shift in a second way. The birds that had built the tightest routines around your specific habits, the ones whose arrival times correlated most closely with the moments you typically appeared, began to redistribute their behavior in ways that supplementary feeding research has documented in enough detail to describe with confidence. They did not leave the yard. The trees were still theirs, the shrubs were still theirs, the water sources were still theirs. The territorial boundaries that governed their movements had not changed in any meaningful way. What changed was the value assigned to the specific node in the territory that you had represented, a high-reliability, time-stamped, human-origin resource that had been one of the most predictable elements in their environment, and that had now failed twice in a single day. The yard was not empty. It was exactly as full as it had always been. But it was recalibrating around the absence of the most consistent thing in it. And you were unpacking boxes the week after what they are actually looking for. By the second and third day, the visit pattern had shifted in a way that supplementary feeding data describes consistently across species. Feeder visit frequency dropped in some documented cases by more than half, even when the feeder remained fully stocked. This is the detail that most people find counterintuitive when they first encounter it, because the instinctive assumption is that birds visit feeders to access food, and if the food is still there, the visits should continue at the same rate. But that assumption misunderstands what the feeder represented within the larger system those birds had been operating in. The feeder was not, by that point in your residency, simply a food source. It was a node in a relationship, one side of a transactional dynamic that had developed over enough time to become embedded in the bird's behavioral model of their territory. And the other side of that transaction, the side that had been reliable enough to be trusted, was not the feeder. It was you. Your presence, your timing, your consistency, the specific set of signals that your daily routine generated, and that the birds in your yard had learned to read as predictors of resource availability. When that presence disappeared, the feeder did not become less full. It became less meaningful. The resource was still there, but the reliability signal that had given it context was gone, and without that signal, the feeder was demoted from primary resource to to something closer to a backup option still visited, but no longer the organizing center of the morning routine it had once been. But here is what the research shows that the visit frequency data alone does not capture. The birds did not redistribute toward other food sources in proportion to their decrease in feeder visits. Instead, many of them redistributed toward locations in the yard that had no food at all, near the house, near the windows, near the door that used to open at a predictable time, near the corners of the yard where your shadow had fallen when you moved through it in the mornings. This pattern, documented in studies examining the spatial behavior of habituated backyard birds during periods of human absence, does not fit the profile of resource-seeking behavior. Birds seeking food move toward food. These birds were moving toward the places where a person used to be. The scientific framework for understanding this behavior comes largely from research on individual recognition in birds, a field that has expanded considerably over the past 2 decades. Dr. John Marsloff and his colleagues at the University of Washington have produced some of the most detailed documentation of this capacity, demonstrating through controlled experiments that corvids, and to a meaningful extent, other species, including some passerines, are capable of recognizing specific human individuals by face and retaining that recognition over periods of years, not days or weeks. The recognition is not categorical in the sense of distinguishing humans from non-humans. It is specific: this person, this face, this pattern of movement and sound and timing associated with this set of outcomes in this location. The information that underlies that recognition is stored in the region of the avian brain responsible for long-term social memory, the same neural architecture that processes the identity of flock members, the reliability of specific environmental agents, and the difference between a known individual and an unknown one. When a bird at your feeder had been observing you regularly over a period of months, it was not simply acclimating to human presence in general. It was building a detailed behavioral profile of you, specifically encoding your visual signature, the rhythm of your movements, the timing of your appearances, and the outcomes that reliably followed from your presence. That profile did not disappear when you moved. It remained active, and in the days after your departure, it was being used. Ornithologists studying expectancy maintenance, the behavioral pattern in which animals continue to allocate time and energy toward locations or agents associated with a formerly reliable resource, have documented that the maintenance period for habituated backyard birds following a human absence can extend from several days to several weeks, depending on the species and the duration of the original relationship. During this period, the birds are not simply hanging around a location out of habit. They are actively investing biological energy time that could be spent foraging elsewhere. Calories that have a real cost in the possibility that the pattern they had learned to rely on will resume. The investment is proportional to how strongly the original pattern was encoded, which is itself a function of how long it was consistent and how high its value was within the bird's overall resource map. In the week after you moved, while you were establishing new routines in a new place, while you were learning which drawer the silverware belonged in, and whether the morning light came from the east or west window, the birds in your old yard were in the middle of this maintenance period. They were coming to the places you used to be. They were checking the door. They were monitoring the window. They were allocating energy in the precise biological sense of that phrase to the possibility that the person they had learned to predict would reappear. You were not thinking about them. You had no particular reason to be. You had a new place to learn and a life to reassemble. And the birds in the yard you had left were not part of the calculation, but they were running a calculation of their own in the only terms available to them. And the result of that calculation was the same each morning. The pattern had not resumed. The person had not returned, and the maintenance period would continue for another day. Not forever. Nothing continues forever. But for longer than most people would expect, and with more biological commitment than the casual observer would guess. The birds you left behind were engaged in something that looked in every measurable way like waiting. The new family moves in, how your birds measure strangers against you. At some point, after you left a week later, 2 weeks a month, someone else moved into your old house. They brought their own furniture and their own routines and their own way of moving through rooms that had until recently been organized around a different life. They may have noticed the feeder in the yard, or they may not have. They may have topped it up out of habit or curiosity, or they may have taken it down, or they may have simply left it where it was and ignored it. Whatever they did it as strangers to the birds in that yard, which is to say, they arrived into an established social ecosystem with no history, no encoded reliability, and no relationship with any of the animals whose territory they had just moved into. The birds noticed them immediately, not because new humans are alarming in the way that predators are alarming, but because every behavioral research framework that has been applied to habituated backyard bird populations shows the same thing. When the human agent associated with a resource changes, the birds enter a period of what researchers in animal behavior have termed social reevaluation. This is not a passive process. It is an active, energy-intensive behavioral mode in which the birds observe the new agent with greater frequency, approach the resource area with greater caution, and apply the same evaluative criteria to the newcomer that they had previously applied to the person who established the relationship in the first place. Those criteria are worth understanding in detail because they are not neutral. They are not a blank slate against which the new residents of your old home are being measured from zero. They are a set of standards that were calibrated against you, against your timing, your consistency, your specific patterns of behavior in and around that yard. And the new residents are being evaluated against that calibration, whether they know it or not. The primary criterion is temporal consistency. Research on resource reliability in avian behavior has established that birds weight the predictability of a food source more heavily than its abundance. A feeder that is reliably restocked at the same time each day will attract and retain more habituated visitors than a feeder that provides twice as much food but on an unpredictable schedule. This preference for reliability over quantity is not a quirk. It is a deeply rational adaptive strategy in animals whose survival depends on accurately modeling their environment. When you lived in that house, you had, over the course of months or years, established a level of temporal consistency that the birds had learned to depend on. The new residents have established nothing. Every day that passes without a consistent pattern being reinforced is another data point in the bird's evaluation that the new agents are less reliable than the previous one. The second criterion is behavioral legibility. Birds that have habituated to a specific human have done so in part because that human's behavior through repetition became predictable enough to be read. The way you moved through the yard, the sequence of actions that preceded feeder maintenance, the degree of attention you paid to the birds when you were outside, all of it had been observed, encoded, and used to generate predictions. The new residents generate no such predictions because they have no history. Their movements are novel, their schedule is unknown, and their level of interest in the birds is unestablished. From the bird's perspective, this is not simply different from what came before. It is a step down in informational value, a reduction in the legibility of an agent that is now responsible for a resource that used to be embedded in a highly legible relationship. The third criterion, and in some ways the most consequential one, is the degree of social acknowledgement. Research on human-animal interaction in backyard bird contexts has suggested that birds distinguish between humans who engage in what might loosely be described as mutual attention, pausing near the feeder, orienting toward the birds, behaving in ways that indicate awareness of their presence, and humans who move through the yard as though the birds were simply part of the furniture. The former category tends to generate faster habituation and stronger relationship formation. The new residents of your old home may be perfectly attentive and engaged people, but they are starting from zero. They have no history with these birds, and the birds are not grading on a curve. The evaluation period that follows a change in the human agent associated with a resource has been estimated in supplementary feeding research to last between 3 and 6 weeks before meaningful rehabilitation begins to occur, assuming the new residents behave consistently and provide food reliably. During those weeks, the birds in your old yard are operating in a state of elevated vigilance, more cautious in their approach to the feeder, more likely to flush at sudden movements, less willing to use the positions close to the house that they had established during your residency. They are observing. They are measuring. And the standard against which they are measuring is the behavioral record they accumulated during the time you were there. This is the mechanism that most people, when they learn about it, find hardest to sit with. Not because it is distressing in an obvious way, but because it implies something about the relationship they had with those birds that they had never fully registered while it was happening. The birds in your yard were not simply tolerating your presence or treating you as a convenient food dispenser. They had built a detailed model of you, specifically of your timing, your movements, your reliability, your behavioral signatures, and that model was now being used as the benchmark against which every subsequent human in that yard would be evaluated. The new residents would have to earn what you had accumulated without knowing you were accumulating it. Some of them will. Given enough time, enough consistency, enough quiet attention paid to the birds in that yard, the new residents will eventually build their own relationships with the same animals that once organized their mornings around your schedule. The process will take months. It will require the kind of unconscious daily commitment that you provided without thinking about it, because you were simply living your life in a place where birds happen to be present, and they happen to be paying attention. But in those first weeks, after the transition, in the gap between the relationship that ended when you drove away and the relationship that has not yet begun to form, there's a period of absence that the birds in your old yard are navigating without any of the conceptual tools that would allow them to understand what happened. They do not have a framework for the person moved. They do not have a category for this arrangement is now permanent. They have the record they built of you, the absence signal that replaced it, and the new humans moving through the space with none of the history that you left behind them. And every morning they are still measuring, not forever, but for longer than you know, and with more precision than most people would imagine possible for creatures whose entire lives fit within the boundaries of a suburban yard, the new yard. How you become someone else's benchmark. You're in a new place now. The yard, if there is a yard, is unfamiliar in the specific way that outdoor spaces are unfamiliar when you have not spent enough time in them to understand what they sound like at 6 in the morning, or where the light falls in the late afternoon, or which corners tend to accumulate the debris that yards accumulate when no one is paying close attention to them. The birds in this new yard, if there are birds, do not know you exist. You are not yet part of their model. You are at this moment simply a new human-shaped variable in an environment that was organized around different patterns before you arrived. The process that is about to begin between you and those birds is the same process that began years or months ago between you and the birds in the yard you left behind. It will follow the same stages, operate through the same neurological mechanisms, and take roughly the same amount of time to produce the same level of relationship, assuming you provide the same level of consistency that you provided before, which is to say, assuming you simply live your life in this new place the way you lived it in the old one. What the research on avian habituation to human agents tells us about this process is more detailed than most people expect. The initial phase, which researchers sometimes describe as the assessment period, typically lasts between 2 and 4 weeks for common backyard species, such as chickadees, nuthatches, cardinals, and house finches. During this period, the birds are present in the yard and aware of the new feeder if one has been provided, but their approach distances are longer. Their visit durations are shorter, and their sensitivity to human movement near the food source is significantly higher than it will be once habituation has occurred. They are not avoiding you. They are observing you. They are collecting the data points that will eventually allow them to build the model that once built will make your movements as readable to them as a weather pattern. The temporal cues you generate during this period matter more than most people realize. Research on the formation of human-associated resource expectations in habituated bird populations has consistently found that the single most powerful predictor of how quickly and how strongly birds habituate to a specific human is the consistency of that human's schedule specifically. The degree to which the timing of feeder maintenance and human presence in the yard can be predicted by the birds across multiple days. A person who refills the feeder at irregular intervals and spends unpredictable amounts of time in the yard will accumulate a relationship with the local birds much more slowly than a person who maintains a consistent routine, even if the latter person provides less food in absolute terms. The birds are not primarily tracking abundance, they are tracking reliability. And reliability, in this context, is simply the degree to which your behavior allows them to form accurate predictions about your behavior. This is worth understanding in terms of what it means for the relationship you are about to build. Every morning that you appear in your new yard at roughly the same time, every day that you refill the feeder within a consistent window, every occasion on which you move through the outdoor space with the kind of quiet, unhurried presence that birds register as non-threatening, all of it is being absorbed into the models that the local birds are building of you. You are not aware of this process while it is happening. It does not require your attention or your intention. It requires only your consistency, which is something that most people provide simply by virtue of having a daily routine. The species composition of your new yard will determine the specific characteristics of the relationships that form. Corvids, crows, and jays tend to build the most sophisticated individual recognition profiles of any common backyard species, and once a crow has encoded a specific human as reliable and non-threatening, that encoding persists for years and is potentially shared with other members of the crow's social group through a process of social transmission that researchers have documented in multiple studies. Chickadees form strong individual associations with human feeders and have demonstrated in laboratory and field settings the ability to retain specific human-associated memories across seasons and, in some documented cases, across years. Cardinals and house finches operate on somewhat shorter timescales, but show the same fundamental pattern of individual-based habituation. They are not simply getting used to humans in general, they are getting used to you specifically. And the relationship they form is with the behavioral signature you generate, not with a generic human template. The accumulation of that relationship is slow enough that most people do not notice it happening. There is no obvious inflection point at which the birds in your new yard shift from treating you as an unknown variable to treating you as a known and trusted one. The change is gradual, expressed in small calibrations of approach distance and visit duration, and the willingness to remain at the feeder when you appear at the window rather than flushing immediately. By the time you notice that the birds in your new yard seem comfortable around you, that they do not startle the way they once did, that they arrive more quickly after you refill the feeder, that some of them have begun to appear at the window in the mornings. Before you have gone outside, the process has been underway for weeks. The relationship has already been built. You simply were not watching it being constructed. And when it is fully established, when your schedule has been encoded, and your movements have been made legible, and your presence has been integrated into the daily routine of the birds, in this new place you will have become for a community of animals that you may never think of as having memories, the benchmark against which every subsequent change in that yard will be measured. If you travel for a week, the birds will run the same verification loop that the birds in your old yard ran the morning you moved. If your schedule changes, they will register the anomaly and recalibrate. If you eventually leave this place too, if another move comes, as moves tend to come, the birds you built a relationship with here will evaluate the next person to stand in your yard against the record they accumulated of you. This is the loop that connects the yard you left to the yard you are building. It does not require awareness on your part to operate. It does not require intention or affection or any conscious acknowledgement that a relationship is being formed. It requires only the ordinary consistency of a life being lived in a place where birds are present and paying attention. The birds in your old yard are still paying attention. They are still measuring the new residents against a standard they built from you in the mornings before you knew they were watching that carefully. The measurement will soften over time. New patterns will form. The record will not disappear, but it will become less active as the new relationship accretes around it. But in the new yard, something else is beginning. The birds here do not know yet what you are like. They have not encoded your timing, or your movements, or the sound your door makes when you push it open in the morning. They have not decided whether you are reliable. They have not built you into their model of how this space works, or begun organizing their mornings around the expectation of your presence. All of that is still ahead of you. It begins the next time you go outside.